Hey Bone Squad, today we will be discussing notorious killer Nannie Doss, aka the Giggling Nanny, aka the Giggling Granny, aka the Jolly Black Widow. Nannie Doss was born Nancy Hazel on November 4, 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, to James and Lou Hazel. She spent much of her childhood avoiding the horrible wrath of her father. He lorded over the family with an iron fist. At age 7, Nannie was on a train when it stopped suddenly. She was thrown forward and hit her head. This accident caused her to have bouts of depression, migraines, and blackouts. If his children were needed to work on the family farm, James would not hesitate to pull them out of school. With education such a low priority, her parents had no objections when she decided to quit school for good after completing the 6th grade. James Hazel refused to let his daughters do anything that would enhance their appearance. Makeup and pretty dresses were forbidden. They also were banned from having friends of the opposite sex. It wasn't until 1921, while working at her first job, that Nannie had any interactions at all with boys. While other kids her age were attending school and worrying about what to wear to prom, Nannie was working at a linen factory and spending all her spare time on her favorite hobby, which was reading romance magazines. The Lonely Hearts Club section was her very favorite. While working at this factory, Nannie met Charlie Braggs, a co-worker who took care of his unwed mother. They began dating and within 5 months were married. Nannie decided to leave her oppressive home behind, and she moved in with Braggs and his mother. She was sadly mistaken about leaving an oppressive environment. Her mother-in-law was extremely controlling and manipulative. Nannie and Charlie had their first child in 1923, followed in rapid succession by 3 more children over the next 3 years. Her life became a prison of raising children, taking care of her demanding mother-in-law, and putting up with her husband Charlie, who was an abusive, adulterous drunk. To cope with her demanding and depressing life, Nannie took up drinking and going to bars to have her own adulterous trysts. Their marriage was doomed. In 1927, soon after the birth of their 4th child, their 2 middle children died from what the doctor determined to be food poisoning. Suspecting that Nannie had poisoned them, Charlie took off with their oldest child, Malvina, but left the newborn Florine with her mother, Nannie. Not long after Charlie's departure, his mother died. Nannie remained in the home until a year later, when Charlie returned with their oldest daughter and a new girlfriend. The 2 divorced. Nannie left with her children and returned to her parents' home. Charlie was the only husband who Nannie didn't poison to death. Nannie returned to her teenage hobby of reading romance magazines, although this time she began to correspond with some of the men who advertised in them. This is where she met husband number 2, Robert Harrelson. They met and married and lived in Jacksonville, Alabama, with Nannie's children, Malvina and Florine. Nannie realized that once again she married a man who lacked any of the appeal that the men in her romance magazines had. Robert was a drunk and in debt. His favorite pastime was getting into bar fights. By some miracle, their union lasted until Robert's death, 16 years later. In 1943, Nannie's oldest daughter, Malvina, had her first child, a son named Robert, followed in 1945 by another child. The second child, a healthy baby girl, died shortly after birth for unknown reasons. Malvina was in and out of consciousness after a very difficult delivery, although she claimed she saw her mother stick a hat pin into the head of her newborn daughter. Sadly, no proof of this was found. On July 7, 1945, Nannie was taking care of her grandson Robert, after she and Malvina fought about Nannie's disapproval of her new boyfriend. That night, while in his grandmother's care, Robert died from what the doctors called asphyxia of unknown causes. Within a few months, Nannie collected a $500 insurance policy she had taken out on her grandson's life. On September 15, 1945, her husband Robert became ill and died. Nannie told others that the evening before he'd come home drunk and raped her. She had poured rat poison into his jar of corn whiskey and watched his suffering as it took effect and eventually took his life. Figuring that she'd nabbed a husband using the Lonely Hearts Club ads in the past, she decided to use them on her hunt for husband number 3. Within 2 days of meeting one another, Nannie and Arlie Lanning were married. Like her former husband, Lanning was also an alcoholic, but he wasn't violent or adulterous. This time it was Nannie who would vanish for months on end. In 1950, and after 2.5 years of wedded bliss, Arlie became ill and died. At the time of death, it was believed that he died of a heart attack brought on by the flu. He had all the flu-like symptoms: fever, vomiting, and stomach pain. With his history of alcohol abuse, doctors believed that his body simply couldn't handle the stress the flu had put on it, so no autopsy was performed. Arlie left his home to his sister, but within 2 months it mysteriously burned down before the sister was able to take ownership. Nannie moved in temporarily with Arlie's mother. However, when she received an insurance check for the burned house, she took off. Nannie was in a hurry to see her sister Debbie, who was dying of cancer. Just before leaving her mother-in-law's home, Arlie's mother died in her sleep. Not surprisingly, Debbie soon died too while in Nannie's care. Nannie decided to not only rely on the Lonely Hearts Club classified ads, but she expanded her search by joining a singles club. She joined the Diamond Circle Club, which is where she met her fourth husband, Richard L. Morton of Emporia, Kansas. They married in October of 1952. Thankfully, Mr. Morton wasn't an alcoholic. However, he was a cheater. When Nannie learned that he was seeing his old girlfriend on the side, he was marked for death. Besides, she had her sights set on a new man from Kansas named Samuel Doss. Before Nannie could eliminate Mr. Morton, her father up and died, so her mother Louisa dropped in for a visit. In a matter of days, her mother was dead after complaining of severe stomach pain. Nannie's husband, Mr. Morton, met the same fate 3 months later. Very quickly after Mr. Morton's death, Nannie moved to Oklahoma and soon became Mrs. Samuel Doss. Sam Doss was a Nazarene minister, dealing with the death of his wife and 9 of his children. They had been killed by a tornado. Samuel was a good, decent man. He was not a cheater, a drunk, or an abusive husband. He was a religious, church-going man who fell head over heels for Nannie. Unfortunately for him, he had 2 other flaws. He was painfully frugal and boring. He led a very strict and regimented life, and he expected his new wife to do the same. No romance novels or love stories on television were permitted, and bedtime was at 9:30 every single night. He had tight control of the finances and gave very little money to his wife. This didn't sit right with Nannie, so she went off to Alabama and only agreed to come home when Samuel agreed to put her name on his checking account. She came home and was the doting wife once she was put on his checking account. She also convinced Samuel to take out 2 life insurance policies, with her being the sole beneficiary. Nearly as quickly as the ink had dried, Samuel was in the hospital complaining of severe stomach cramps. He managed to survive for 2 weeks, long enough to begin to feel better and get discharged from the hospital and sent home. On his first night home, his doting wife served him a home-cooked meal, and within hours of eating, Samuel was dead. Samuel's doctors were alarmed at his sudden passing and ordered an autopsy. The autopsy revealed that his organs were full of arsenic, and every sign pointed to Nannie as being the culprit. Police quickly brought Nannie in for questioning. She confessed to killing 4 of her husbands, her own mother, her sister Debbie, her grandson Robert, and also her mother-in-law Arlie Lanning's mother. Despite being a prolific killer, Nannie seemed to enjoy the public attention she got for her crimes. She often made jokes about her dead husbands and how she had killed them. Those overseeing her case failed to see the humor. On May 17, 1955, when Nannie was 50 years old, she had confessed to Samuel's murder and was given a life sentence. In 1963, after spending 8 years in prison, Nannie died of leukemia in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She was never charged with any additional murders, although it is believed she killed as many as 11 people. So what are your thoughts on Nannie Doss? Were you surprised by her crimes? I think she is a prime example of the phrase, looks can be deceiving. Well, that's all for today, guys. Thank you for watching. Bye!